First story. The Curse of Blackwood, Crescent Moon. No one has ever left Blackwood Cemetery alive. This was the whispered warning among the townspeople. But for Alex and Brian, it was just an old myth, one meant to scare little kids. But they weren't kids. They wanted to prove it was nothing but a silly superstition. That night, the air was heavy with fog, swirling like a restless spirit over the ground. Alex glanced at his friend and said, "Are you still sure this is a good idea?" Brian let out a nervous chuckle and replied, "As long as we come back alive, yeah." The iron gate creaked open, its sound like a dying person's final breath. Alex shined his flashlight ahead, but the fog was so thick that they could barely see a few feet in front of them. The tombstone stood cracked and ancient, silently waiting, almost as if expecting new visitors. The deeper they walked, the heavier the air became. It felt like something unseen was watching them. Suddenly, Brian heard a faint rustling sound behind them. "Alex, did you hear that?" Alex turned around, but there was only mist. Probably just an animal, but even he didn't believe his own words. They kept walking until they reached a particular gravestone. It looked different from the rest, too fresh, as if someone had just been buried there yesterday. But what made their blood run cold was the name on it. Alex Gray and Brian Miller. Died March 3, 2025. Brian's voice shook as he whispered, "Tonight is March 3, 2025. Their hearts pounded violently. Before they could move, the ground beneath them trembled. From inside the grave, a blackened, decayed hand burst out. Its long, jagged nails scraped against the dirt, and a terrifying sound rose from below, as if something was crawling its way to the surface. Suddenly, Alex's flashlight flickered off. Darkness swallowed them whole. Brian screamed, "Run! We need to get out of here." But Alex didn't move. "Brian! Someone is breathing, right behind me." Brian shakily lifted his flashlight. What he saw made his blood freeze. A monstrous figure stood right behind Alex. Its eyes were pitch black, its skeletal hands reached forward, and its mouth hung open as if it were about to consume them. "Run!" Alex shouted, but Brian stumbled backward, feeling something cold wrap around his ankle, rotting hands rising from the soil. Alex's scream echoed through the graveyard. Brian turned, but his friend was gone. All that remained was a trail of blood leading into the grave. Brian collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. His heart pounded like a war drum. Then, suddenly, a voice whispered in his ear, "The curse is complete. Now it's your turn." Before he could even scream, shadowy hands grabbed him from behind, covering his mouth, and dragged him into the darkness. But it wasn't over yet. Brian's eyes slowly fluttered open, but he wasn't in the cemetery anymore. He was inside a coffin. Panic set in as he frantically ran his hands along the wooden walls. He screamed, "Help! Someone get me out of here!" No answer. Then, laughter, twisted, inhuman laughter echoed from outside the coffin. A voice whispered, "Welcome to our cemetery. You are one of us now." The coffin walls began to close in. His breath shortened. Dirt seeped through the cracks, filling his mouth, his nose. Silence returned to the cemetery. The next morning, the caretaker found two freshly dug graves. The names on them were clear: Alex Gray and Brian Miller, those who mocked fate and paid the price. And somewhere in the shadows of Blackwood Cemetery, two pairs of black, soulless eyes watched. Eyes that once belonged to Alex and Brian, but not anymore. Next story. The Graveyard Keeper. Crescent moon. In the cemetery, the dead are silent, but there's always someone who stays awake. Willow Hill Cemetery was over a century old, filled with cracked gravestones and withered trees casting eerie shadows over the ground. No one dared to go near it after sunset, except for one person, the cemetery keeper, Mr. Wilson. He had been watching over the dead in silence for years. No one knew much about him. A tall, thin man with a gaunt face, always with eyes that seemed emotionless and movements that were slow. The only thing people knew for sure was that he never left the cemetery. Not by day, not by night. He's just a simple caretaker, right? That was the thought of Mark and Jimmy. They were two adventurous friends who had made a bet to spend one night in the cemetery. 12 o'clock 12 a.m. The moon hung high in the sky, but its light couldn't pierce the cemetery's darkness. Mark and Jimmy walked cautiously between the old gravestones. Everything was quiet, too quiet. Jimmy laughed and said, "Well, where are all these restless spirits?" "We're waiting." Mark shrugged. "Just a bunch of gravestones and a strange old man." They made their way toward the small wooden shack at the edge of the cemetery. The windows were dark, but inside, a small candle still burned. "So, Wilson's still awake," Mark mischievously said. "Let's see what that strange old man is up to." But just as they took a step toward the shack, the door swung open. Mr. Wilson stood there, tall, with a dry, emotionless face. His eyes were cold and motionless, just like the dead. He spoke in a calm voice. "Tonight isn't a good night to stay." Mark smirked. "Really? Are the dead coming out tonight?" But the caretaker didn't move. He simply shut the door and turned off the light inside. The cemetery's silence grew heavier. Jimmy whispered, "Mark, I've got a bad feeling." Mark laughed it off, but his hands had turned cold. He could feel it too now. Suddenly, a sound echoed from the graves. It was like the sound of nails scraping on stone. They turned toward the noise. The graves were lost in the mist, but someone was standing among them. No, several people, tall, indistinct shadows, standing between the graves. Motionless, just watching. Mark whispered, "Are they people?" Jimmy took a step back, but a sound of crunching earth made him freeze. He looked down, and his breath caught. Beneath his feet, a skeletal hand had risen from the dirt. The hands began to move, emerging from the graves, some still covered in decayed flesh. Jimmy screamed and ran, but one of the hands grabbed his ankle. Cold, dry, with an unnatural strength. Mark yelled, "No, no, this can't be real." But before he could help, another pair of hands grabbed him from behind. A whisper echoed in their ears. "You came to our cemetery. Now, you're one of us." Mark and Jimmy struggled, but the soft earth beneath them was pulling them down. The ground was swallowing them whole. The last thing they saw, Mr. Wilson's eyes. He was standing there in the darkness, watching. His eyes were no longer human. Black, endless, full of something no one should ever see. In silence, he smiled. 9 o'clock the next morning. The cemetery keeper calmly stepped out of his shack. He took a deep breath and looked over the cemetery. Everything was calm. Fresh graves had sunk into the earth. The names on them were clear. Mark Watson and Jimmy Carter. Those who ignored the warnings and stayed forever. Mr. Wilson smiled faintly and walked toward their graves. Softly, he muttered under his breath, "The dead always need a new keeper." The end.
Don't forget, like and subscribe for more stories. And don't be spellbound.